Welcome to part 2 of our 4-part course, the Chassidic approach to dealing with loss and failure. In this part 2, we will be addressing the spiritual dynamics. What are the deeper roots for difficulties and challenges? Is there purpose? And what is the purpose of setbacks? And above all, by understanding these spiritual dynamics, how can we incorporate that and apply that into our own lives to not only be able to contend with these challenges, but actually to transform them? So welcome. Rabbi Jacobson here. If you heard the first part of this 4-part course, we discussed the psychological and historical lessons from different case studies of dealing with challenges, failures, setbacks. But now we're going to enter deeper and go dig deeper into the deeper roots, going all the way back to the very engine room where life itself began. The Kabbalistic and mystical teachings discuss and elaborate on how was there suffering in the first place. Why is life not just a simple, seamless, beautiful, loving life of health, joy, celebration? Why should there be pain? Why should there be setbacks? Why should people be hurt? And the answers are quite fascinating. So let's begin with a very broad, overarching question in general. The purpose of life itself. Now, building on the assumption, and it's important to state the assumption, that life, as we know it, is not an accident. It was put here by design, purpose. Some people are comfortable with the word God. Some people are comfortable with the word cosmic engineer or architect, artist. But based on that assumption, you have to wonder, like that big question that's always asked about suffering, what's the purpose of suffering? Why do good people suffer? Why do bad people prosper? Why is it even possible in a world created by design? If you created a machine, is there any reason that the machine has to experience suffering in its life? Loss, failure? Now, human beings can misuse the machine, and then it can cause damages and damaging implications. But the machine on its own, based on the creator, should be a perfectly humming along, seamless, beautiful machine. If you look at life that way, where's there room for anything that's a flaw? With humans, you could argue, okay, an engineer, an architect built a beautiful machine, a beautiful home, a beautiful structure. But you know what? They miscalculated. People know about the Williamsburg Bridge, for example, that one of the 3 bridges in Lower Manhattan that attaches and connects Brooklyn to Manhattan. So the Williamsburg Bridge, the engineer, the architect, miscalculated. So at some point, the bridge had to adjust. If I recall correctly, this may be urban legend or may be true. I don't want to even say it. But let me say it, he took his own life. He was so devastated by his miscalculation. So human beings can miscalculate. But even there, the miscalculation is not the bridge is a very functional bridge. They just had to adjust something so it didn't have the perfect symmetry. Even though they adjusted recently to some extent, but it's not perfect. Fine. So for a human art, but that's a human being. When you talk about the cosmic, the divine architect, where's there room for a flaw that should be causing problems? So of course people answer the first knee-jerk reaction, free will. Since we have free will, we have the capacity to hurt each other, to be injustice from human to human. But the very possibility for that, the Kabbalists wonder, how's that possible? Now this course isn't just addressing suffering and pain, it's also addressing, and primarily addressing, human setbacks, failings, and so on. But that too falls under the same question. Where's there room for it? You could say, in actuality, it's not done by the creator, by the architect. But human beings end up doing it. But how is there a possibility? If you're talking about a completely perfect environment, there should be no room for it, no possibility, no potential. This question is one that plagues every thinker from the beginning of time. And we're going to be addressing it from the context of the Kabbalists and the mystical approach to it. But let me add another question before we go into the answer. The human race is like one large organism, just as we see nature. If no one intervenes, nature is a beautiful symmetry of millions and billions and trillions of different cells, species, all working together in a perfect harmony. The human being is part of that balance. So how is it possible, as the Kabbalists, that one human being can hurt another? If we're all part of one entity, it would be like the right arm suddenly not liking the left arm and attacking it. That's a particular type of disease when the body turns on itself. It's a terrible disease, but it's a disease. So how is it possible? All the wars, all the battles, all the divisiveness, how is that all even come into play? When you're dealing with one large organism. So again, the answer is free will. But that's not the question how it happens. How is it possible to happen? And here is where I'd like to introduce you to two primary mystical concepts. One is called the tzimtzum. I'll translate in a moment. And one is called shvirat hakelim. The literal translation of tzimtzum is condensation, compressing, concealment. Sometimes contraction is used. A bunch of C's. The literal translation of shvirat hakelim is the shattering or the breaking of the containers. What are these ideas? So here comes the big dilemma, the biggest one of them all. The idea of God and God's oneness is fundamental to Jewish thought. We say it in all the prayers. It's primarily in the most famous liturgy of them all, the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, oneness. But oneness doesn't just mean one and not two, negating duality or plurality. One means one reality. So since God is omnipresent and omnipotent, so where's there room for another independent consciousness called you and I? So some Kabbalists explain, well, God does not get engaged on that level, and we have no relationship with the God consciousness. We only relate to God where God allows another consciousness to emerge. Besides the fact that it still doesn't answer the question, so what happened to God's consciousness? It also means we don't really have a relationship with a divine higher consciousness. Comes the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, a great Kabbalist, the 15th century, and says the concept of tzimtzum, that the divine consciousness, that divine energy, concealed itself in order to allow space and room for an independent consciousness. Example given from the Alter Rebbe of Shneur Zalman of Liadi, a teacher, a brilliant teacher. If he allows himself or herself to just allow their consciousness to flow, there'd be no room, no possibility for someone, a student, to even be present. So they conceal all their brilliance. And then begins a very narrow stream of consciousness where you start teaching the student, each student according to its brain and the mind parameters. So from the point of view of the teacher, nothing has changed. The teacher has not become less brilliant. She's just not expressing it. So the teacher remains intact. The consciousness of the teacher is concealed, even in a way from himself. because he's not accessing it right now. It's like right now you have in your mind millions, if not more, ideas. Doesn't mean you're accessing and actively being conscious of them. You may easily retrieve them, but they're like in a filing cabinet, in a state of what the Kabbalists call superconscious state. That's even on a human level. So this is what happens, tzimtzum. So tzimtzum is like the light or the energy that filled everything. And now that energy receded on a conscious level, allowing space for another consciousness to emerge, like the student. And then a very narrow stream, what the Kabbalists call kav v'chut, the Arizal calls kav v'chut, which means a line and a thread. Think of it like a very narrow stream, like a laser beam energy. That is not all of the consciousness of the divine that was preceded this tzimtzum. That begins to flow to each particular dimension and its parameters through the hierarchy of what's called the cosmic order. And there we have distinction, hierarchy, differences in time and space, which defines existence as we know it. That there are definitions, there are categories, there's real infrastructure. Now what happens to that energy? It remains there, and we can ultimately access it. Just like the student, the beginner student in the beginning has to only learn ABC, but slowly as the mind expands of the student, you can receive more and more of the energy of the teacher, to the point that you can even reach the same level and even surpass your teacher. So indeed, the Kabbalists explain, with a Kabbalist state, and the Chassidic masters explain, that the same is true with the divine energy. Though it's concealed, we can access it, but we have to first build our containers. So what does the tzimtzum achieve? The tzimtzum answers the questions we spoke about before, and coupled with the shattering of the containers, which we'll discuss shortly, it helps us understand the dynamics that ultimately allows for suffering and pain and loss, failure. Because now, since you have now independent consciousness, so now there's a possibility for the independent consciousness, first of all, a dissonance between the independent consciousness of the human being and of the created existence and the divine consciousness that was concealed. In other words, there could be a conflict and dissonance between teacher and student. There could also not be. If it's taught properly, the student understands, but there is now a second entity to contend with. And once you have to contend with it, as soon as there's two, you already have the possibility of disharmony. Not that it has to be. So the tzimtzum therefore creates space. And once you have space for another consciousness, that's where the possibility of the dissonance that results from that ultimately can lead, with plenty of other steps, to a situation where you have an actual setback, failure, difficulty, pain, and suffering. So it's not that the tzimtzum is directly causes it, the tzimtzum allows the environment. In other words, if you were a tyrant, for example, and I don't mean that in a negative way, if you go to total control, and you don't let your children or your students any autonomy, hypothetically. So yes, you may avoid anyone making mistakes because you are in control, but you'll never create an independent entity that has individuality. You'll have to be constantly in control, like a tyrant. That's what I meant by tyrant. As soon as you allow autonomy of your student or your child, right there's the possibility that they may not choose the way you wanted them to choose. They may not be aligned and go along with your plan. But that was the exact purpose of what God wanted. He wanted a relationship with something outside of himself, so to speak, outside. That they feel themselves outside of the divine. Or else there's no purpose for creation. To create puppets and robots that just go through the motions and are not really experiencing things through their own initiative is no purpose. So it all is driven by the ultimate purpose of creation, that God desired to have a dira b'tachtonim, a home for the divine, in the lowest of worlds where the divine is concealed. So right there, that's predicated that there has to be a concealment. If the divine is revealed, it's like the teacher is completely revealed. There's no room for another entity, especially an entity called the lowest of the levels. Number two, we also have now the dynamics, how it works. The tzimtzum allows for the independent entity, And now begins the work for that independent consciousness to connect with its mother consciousness, if you wish, with its source. So there you have the first and most fundamental root of all problems. Because, and to use another example given by Chassidic masters, it's like the father hiding from his child, from his son, in order to elicit the ingenuity and creativity of the child in discovering where the father is. But the father hid himself well. The student begins, the child begins to seek and search, and you know what? Can't find his father. Two possibilities now. Either he keeps on searching and finds new methods and new creative ideas how to dig deeper, or he gives up. If he gives up, what do you think happens next? He starts building a life based on his own agenda. Till now, the whole purpose of the concealment was the concealment of the teacher in order to be able to teach the student, in order to be able to elicit from the student the student's efforts. But once you give up, once the father is hidden so well, or the teacher is so silent, and the student says, my teacher has forsaken me, that's when all the problems begin. So to put it in other terms, every failure, every setback, every challenge, every difficulty is essentially a distorted form, or better put, a misunderstanding of what concealment is about. If there was no concealment in the first place, we wouldn't even exist. There wouldn't be an independent consciousness. Concealment has to have built into it the possibility that you may not find what you're looking for initially. And that's where free will plus concealment, that's where the problems begin. Because once you give up, so now I'm on my own. Who says I have another consciousness to seek out? Who says I need to find that higher state of awareness? And once you begin building your own agenda, what do you think happens? Then your agenda is different than my agenda. That was not possible pre-Simpson, because then the divine consciousness subsumed and consumed everything. Nothing else existed. Then when the concealment happened, the intention was for us to see through it and see it as a catalyst and stepping stone to find the light that's concealed within. Concealed. As soon as we stop, that's when we start taking the tzimtzum as an end in itself, the concealment. So now you have your agenda, I have my agenda, egos come into play, conflicts of interest, and that's just a step away from battle, which can lead to war and much worse. Obviously, it doesn't lead to the worst immediately, but we have now the root of it. But then comes a second component, which is equally vital. Because it's not an airtight situation, the cosmic engineer built in an immune system. Understanding the risks, and the immune system means that something's going to have to give because there's a dissonance going on. It's just as it is psychologically. If a person's living in a very deep type of dissonance or disconnect, you may get away with it for years, but there's something's going to give and something's going to wake you up and feel, 1 second, something's wrong. People develop anxiety, depression, being debilitated. Something's wrong. So this post-Simpson reality has now these two consciousnesses. And as a result, the independent consciousness of the student, or the child for that matter, begins to grow and develop, while others are also developing. At this point, you can still say they all will cooperate and work together. But as they develop further, because there was a concealment, somewhere you need a market correction, for lack of a better word. And that's where the shattering of the containers comes into play. Because again, pre-Simpson, when there's total seamless unity, there's oneness. When there's oneness, there's no room for two, there's no room for conflict. In other words, diversity is beautiful, but diversity could also lead to divisiveness. That's only possible when you have more than one, when you have the tzimtzum. Now that you have more than one, you have several entities, identities, or even more than several, they can potentially conflict with each other. So the goal is, the way the Kabbalists put it, is that the energies and the containers should join seamlessly. Before the tzimtzum, there are no two entities. So you cannot have a conflict between a body and a soul, or to put it in a different term, between the words on a page and the ideas that are being conveyed. But after the tzimtzum, what's vital is that the student who's receiving the energy should fit into his containers. If anywhere the energy is too intense, again, the student will be overwhelmed. So comes now a world, one of these dimensions called toyu, the world of toyu. Toyu literally means chaos. So the energies are there, the containers are there, but they're not compatible. The energy is too intense and the containers are too small. So essentially the shattering of the containers, which is really just an analogy. There are no physical containers. It's an analogy of a dissonance that can't hold. So something has to give. It's like a person who's grown up, let's say, in a home that was dysfunctional, or was adopted, or something traumatic happened. That child is going to feel something is missing. It may take years, but then finally the cry of the soul will be such, I know there's something wrong. I know I wasn't told something. And we'll go seeking, and there can be an explosion, an eruption of an incompatibility. So essentially the shattering of the containers, though on its own, again, sounds very negative, it's actually a result of the dissonance created when the divine truth, seamless and omnipotent and omnipresent reality concealed itself. So now there's like a protest. It's like after a while, something's wrong. The containers shatter, which means there's an incompatibility. And now this is where the concept we hear about tikkun olam. What is tikkun? The repairing of that shattering. So in truth, as the way the Kabbalists and the Chassidic masters put it, they say it's really the shattering of containers in order to build better ones. It's like you raise a building with a Z in order to build a better structure in its place. When a person has psychologically, let's say, a tantrum or a fit of rage or other forms of expression that are very emotional, deep anxiety, depression, it's always a voice coming from your soul. Remember, corpses, God forbid, don't have anxiety. It's coming from a voice from within that says, something is missing. So the mere fact that you can cry out is already a sign of life. Obviously, you want to move forward from there. So the Shviras HaKelim, which is when our lives feel out of sync, because there are energies and there are containers, but they don't work in sync, is actually a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call that time to do something about it. When the chick gets large enough, what will happen to the egg? It will crack. When the child gets large enough, it will exit the womb. All these situations are painful, but they're pain that are meant to bring a new birthing. So the tzimtzum coupled with the Shvirat HaKelim, the concealment, coupled now with its result in some form of dissonance and shattering, is the formula to understand the root of all setbacks, of all concealments. Now, why is this so vital? We all know knowing the root of a problem is always critical, because that way you can solve it from the root, not just symptomatic with a Band-Aid or a painkiller. Why it's so vital is precisely for that reason. Next time you experience anything of a setback or a failure, so the first reaction is, look, what's the matter with me? And it feeds into all our insecurities and fears and validates all those times our parents or other adults dismissed us or basically criticized us. No. As soon as you feel it, you have to realize, 1 second, that means there's some type of dissonance going on. My goal is to repair, not to give in to the shattering, to see through the concealment and discover the deeper light. So it's not just a nice psychological method that something happens, there's some failure, there's some loss. Okay, now figure out how that we can turn that into a catalyst for growth. It's much deeper than that. It's actually understanding that the very failure itself is a result of a force that was meant to bring out the best within us. So this isn't a justification for loss and failure or setbacks or difficulties or pain or suffering. It's coming to understand its dynamic. It's rooted in the ultimate gift of autonomy, of being an independent consciousness. And then from there, it goes further that will create a certain dissonance. It has to. Because pre-Simpson, there's no dissonance. There's only one seamless reality. It would be like you're the only person on earth. You know exactly why you're here. Where's there room for any conflict? But the concealment creates the potential for conflict of interest and other distinctions of that nature. And with the goal, ultimately, to correct that, but we need to first understand something has to give. So to put it, using one of the classic examples, God forbid somebody suffered a stroke, and the left part of their body, their left part of their body paralyzed. Now, of course, they stopped the bleeding, so to speak, but still the paralysis remained. So now this person has to go to a lot of physical therapy, and you're hoping also the neurons and the neural passages will regrow and redirect themselves, which is interesting what happens with the plasticity of the mind and its capacity of regeneration. But the point I really want to make is this. Okay, so now this person is numb, unable to feel. Every day the doctor comes and pricks a needle, no reaction. One day the doctor pricks a needle and the person starts yelling, Why are you sticking a needle in me? Why are you causing me pain? And the doctor is laughing and smiling and celebrating. Because for months you didn't feel it. So is the pain a good thing or a bad thing? Nobody wants pain. But pain is a warning signal that your body's telling you something's wrong, do something about it. If you don't feel any pain, those deep, high degree burns, that to the point that they actually burn the nerve endings so you don't feel the pain, that's very dangerous. You don't feel pain, you can end up doing something very destructive. Pain is a warning signal, it's a red light telling you do something. In this context, pain was that it's beginning to heal. It's beginning to feel something. Shvirat HaKelim is saying, let us feel the pain and the dissonance that the concealment created. You see, the concealment itself is on a very high level. It's really more of a cosmic force, like a cosmic black hole, which doesn't allow, its gravitational pull is so intense, it doesn't allow any light out. But what are the implications? What are the consequences of that? That's where Shvirat HaKelim. So the first time you feel something wrong, see it as a blessing. Because the day before you didn't see the failure. You didn't feel the loss. You didn't think it was a difficulty. Is that better? Some people say it is. I'd rather not know about it. Like people tell their accountants, don't tell me how much I lost. But the truth is, awareness is half the cure. So the feeling of the pain in the case of the stroke victim, our own awareness, and we feel like something has failed, what do you think it does to you? What it should do to you is now say, I'm going to work harder, make sure I don't fail. And that's where these feelings come from. So it's not just understanding the spiritual roots of loss and failure. It's actually identifying that the entire purpose of them. The entire purpose is to make us aware of the dissonance in order that we should correct it. Unfortunately, many of us just follow the script and we just make it worse. We don't see the concealment as concealment. We say, this is reality. We don't see dissonance and the shattering of containers as a problem. That's when the Baal Shem Tov says, Haster, in that day, I will conceal and conceal my face, a double concealment. One is concealment, at least you know it's concealed. The other is, you don't even know it's concealed. The concealment conceals the concealment, and that's much worse because you don't even know there's a problem. The story of the Rabbi Hillel Parasha, he once went down. In the olden days, there was no air conditioning. So on a hot, sweltering day in Russia, so they had these deep cellars under the ground that you can cool off. So he went down to one of them one day, and it's also pitch black. There was no electricity. He says, it's so dark here. And someone says, don't worry, stay here a little while, you get used to it. He says, that's exactly what I'm worried about. I'm going to get used to it. I don't want to get used to it. I want to know what's darkness, what's light. Now, some may prefer the illusion, but we're discussing those that want to see the light. And see the light sometimes has pain involved. I would say every time there's pain. More knowledge, more pain. More awareness, more pain. So failure doesn't feel good. Loss doesn't feel good. Trying something and not succeeding, who wants that? But if you think about the spiritual dynamics we're discussing, you come away and saying, 1 second here. There's something going on that's more than just my comfort zone. I am becoming a greater person. It's like the student feels that the teacher knows so much more, feels the tzimtzum, and understands, right now, I'm receiving this amount. But then when you start feeling inadequate, that actually will stimulate and get you going. I want more. I want more of that consciousness. That's the post-Simpson seeking and feeling there's something lacking. The Shvirat HaKelim drives the point home. It's not just lacking. Something has shattered. Something's really not working well. And then, when you can see through all of that, you come to realize these are all stepping stones to reach, indeed, a deeper consciousness, a deeper light. A light that's even greater than the pre-Simpson light. That's what the Kabbalists and the Chassidic masters write. So you see, my friends, how when you look at the spiritual dynamics, besides getting with the anatomy and dissecting the details of how it came to be, that there should be any form of dissonance, any form of pain, loss, suffering, that's all part of the purpose, but you also understand what its role is. And that helps you see it through. So next time you do experience a failure, a loss, a difficulty, think about these words. That it's not an end in itself. There's something going on. I may not see it right now. Right now I cry. I grieve. But there's something going on, something deeper that's going on. And that ultimately, coupled with what we discussed in the first class, the first part of this 4-part series, you start developing a blueprint. That next time you do have a setback and a failure, how to look at it. And of course, getting your ego and getting yourself out of the way is key, because it helps open us up to broader horizons. To the point that you can say that the pain that I suffered, or the loss, or the setback, was actually part of the growth. It had to happen. The shell had to crack for the chicks to come out. We all have, something has to give, something has to crack in our lives to develop into an adult. Creativity is a child of frustration. There's nothing in life worth talking about that did not go through some metamorphosis, sometimes more extreme than others. And when you're able to embrace that by looking at things that way, in your own life, in your own history, it also dramatically changes how you approach life. Of course, the goal in all this is not just for us to do it, but also to become mentors. And that doesn't need a formal title. Teachers, inspiration to others. Some of us are blessed with doing that. Some can be trained to do it, but it's all part of this great responsibility. So, in the final analysis, what we have here is a deeper understanding of every setback that ever comes your way. It's only possible because the divine, omnipotent and omnipresent consciousness stepped aside, or better put, concealed itself. It's only possible in those conditions. And it will express itself as such. Every form of dissonance, every form of discomfort can be traced to the shattering of the containers, with the goal being to begin to rebuild them. I always like the analogy, think of a narrative, a story, and someone that tears up the pages and scatters them all over the world. And it's your job to start collecting them together and reconstructing it. That's what's called in the Kabbalistic terminology of birur hanitzutzos, clarifying, separating the sparks. And when you're able to do that, that changes the whole way of looking at things. Because then everything that you're looking at that seems like a setback is simply that you're only seeing part of the narrative. You're only looking at the surface level. Look at the bigger picture, and you'll discover a deeper light and a deeper energy in darkness that's even deeper than in light itself. Because the power to conceal is much harder, takes more energy than the power to reveal. Think of an intelligent person. An intelligent person who's listening to an argument or different opinions and bites his tongue or her tongue. It takes a lot more effort to exercise restraint when you hear a lot of different opinions, especially if some of them are foolish. But so therefore, in the concealment lies fundamentally greater energy. But we have to know how to see it through. Because the fact of the matter is, it needs to be revealed in our consciousness in our lives. So there we have part 2 of this course. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about part 3 and part 4. And hopefully we can all come away with a deeper understanding of these ideas. Next week's part 3 discusses how to not be your own worst enemy. And then final part 4, we'll talk about how to help others deal with failure. Please join me. It's been an honor. Simon Jacobson here, Meaningful Life Center, meaningfullife.com. Thank you very much.